Well, good morning. I'm Charles Overby, and I want to welcome all of you to the first program of the spring semester's series of programs here at the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. There's something that sounds good about spring programs. I'm ready for spring. It's good to have you here. We enjoy having these programs. We've got a diverse group of programs that with a wide variety of topics. And I hope you'll come back to quite a few of them. I think you'll learn a lot from those. I always enjoy any program that has a conversation that Curtis Wilkie leads. Curtis, of course, in addition to being a fine teacher, is the senior and inaugural fellow at the Overby Center. And he and I co-teach a class in the fall, and I'm the play-by-play announcer, and he's the color commentator. And I can tell you that Curtis could have a conversation with almost anybody, and it would be interesting. And it's all the more so today because we have a terrific person in Marshall Ramsey, who could just sit here and speak by himself, and it would be entertaining and good. But Curtis and Marshall together are going to be terrific. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad now to turn the program over to my friend Curtis Wilkie.
Marshall is a Georgian. He grew up in Marietta, right outside of Atlanta. He went to the University of Tennessee, was a classmate with my daughter Layton, who lives here in Oxford and is now a Rebel, I'm happy to say. And Marshall, after graduating from UT, had a couple of spots. He worked in Texas and went on to worked in Georgia and Texas and with Copley News Service in San Diego before he was hired as the cartoonist for the Clarion-Ledger, where he has truly graced those pages, editorial pages, for 17, 18 years. Hard to believe you've been here that long, but we're so glad to have you. He's going to show us a collection of some of his work, but I wanted to warm it up and just get Marshall to talk a little bit about your work. How'd you get into this noble line as an editorial cartoonist?
My very first cartoon got me sent to the principal's office. I thought I was going to be a conquering hero. Now, let me set the stage. I was Sprayberry High School, Marietta, Georgia. Sprayberry sounds like Mayberry, but it was about 3,000 students. And my English teacher decided I couldn't write, but she figured out I could draw, so she made me the cartoonist. And back then, we were kind of Luddites. We had typewriters. We didn't have computers. So there would be holes all through the paper. So I wouldn't do anything for the whole semester. And then when the paper came out, I'd fill up all the holes. That was my job. So I drew this really great cartoon of the librarian with a Nazi helmet and a machine gun and a spider web off her nose saying, "Where's your pass, sweetie?" Okay, sweetie was really the icing on the cake. And I thought, you know what, they're going to throw rose petals at my feet the next day because this is the funniest thing that's ever been drawn in history of man. Well, it wasn't, but I thought it was because my ego was a little bit bigger back then. Well, not really, but it was still pretty big. And so I'm thinking this is going to be awesome. The next day, the principal calls me up at 8:30, and I'm sitting across from a crying librarian who is not very happy with me. And the principal looked at me and said, "Explain yourself." And I said, "Look, I don't mean to be disrespectful." Well, okay, I do. But I'm an athlete. I work. The only time I can get in the library is during lunch. And you have to have a lock of your dead grandmother's hair. My grandmother wasn't dead, so that was a problem. A blood sample. You had to have the mortgage on your house. I mean, it was really hard to get in the library. And so the principal looked over and he said, "Is that true?" And she said, "Yeah, we don't want too many people in there." And he said, "Why do you have the library?" And they changed it. And that was the one and only time in my whole career that any one of my cartoons have ever made a difference. But but at that point, I wanted to do it. And I had known when I was 8 that I wanted to do this. And it has been a rather long and bumpy journey. And I will share more of that in a little bit.
You can see it has a little touch of irreverence to him. I guess that helps being a cartoonist. Who have been some of your favorite targets, or should I characterize them as subjects down through the years?
Yeah, Pete Boone's up there nodding, going, yeah, uh-huh, yeah, uh-huh. Sparky's up there going, uh-huh, uh-huh. You know, I once told a mayor of Jackson that if you don't like being in cartoons, go sell cars. It's just kind of part of the deal. I mean, cartoonists have been around since Benjamin Franklin in this country. He drew that wacky one with the snake being caught up, which is hilarious. It's one of my favorites. Nothing funnier than a cut up snake. But, you know, I mean, for me, I lived in San Diego, California, okay? We don't get weather like this in San Diego, California. And so to move to a place where it's 110 in the summer and the roaches fly took a little bit of a leap of faith. But Mississippi is not paradise for weather, but it is for paradise for politicians. I got here when Governor Fordyce was governor, and honestly, it's just been getting better ever since. I've had some incredible, and I think if the judges in Columbia at the Pulitzers had known who Frank Melton was, I probably would have won it 4 years in a row, because Frank was that good.
The mayor of Jackson.
Jackson, yes.
After the incident in Paris last month, I think we've all thought about the repercussions of perhaps being too irreverent. How do you feel? What kind of threats do you face? Have you ever gotten realistic threats, or is it mostly just angry readers?
A little both. I think probably the day that illustrates how I deal with threats the best was April 17, 2001. And that was the day of the Mississippi flag vote. And that day was very contentious. It was a very contentious issue, and people were really hot about it. And I was getting a lot of out-of-state calls from some very not nice people that were threatening me about every 15 minutes. I'd gotten on their calling list. I was so lucky. I'm sure I was on their prayer list too. And they were calling me every 15 minutes, threatening me. And 5:30 that afternoon, my doctor called. And he said, Marshall, I don't know how to tell you this, but you have cancer. And I had malignant melanoma. I didn't know, I had a little baby. I didn't know if I was going to live or not. And, you know, I mean, really, honestly, most cartoonists die of heart attacks. They don't die of, you know, threats. But at that moment, it kind of put everything in perspective. And I do get threats occasionally. People get mad. I mean, that's the beauty of social media. People get angry, and you hear from, I call them the flying monkeys occasionally. People will come in and they'll say things. But I always figure that if there's truly somebody so mad about a cartoon that they're going to come get me, it's not going to be a threat that I hear.
Death threats?
I've had a couple, yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, and that's not even including my marriage, so.
But you haven't had a governor threaten to kick your ass like Fordyce did Burt Case.
He didn't put it in such words, but he did kind of get in my face and point his finger at my nose, which I actually appreciate. I'd rather him, you know, punch me in the nose than stab me in the back.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of give us a good example, those of the students here who might not be as familiar with your work, and give us a presentation, and we're going to pick up the conversation. We'll get some questions from the audience. Okay?
That'd be great. I'm going to go ahead and start with a few Ole Miss cartoons throughout the years, and I've always I love Ole Miss. I love coming up here. Granted, I did graduate from University of Tennessee. I wish y'all would have given me a little bit more money. I would come here. That's how that rolls. But we'll see if we can get this thing. This was during the whole bear thing. Don't tell anyone I'm hiding in the bear suit. That was quite popular, to say the least. Ways to protect the new Ole Miss goalposts and make them retractable, electrify them, cloaking device, mobile, rubber, or edible, make them into cheese fries. Sparky loves this cartoon. This was Sparky and Chancellor Jones here. Sparky, do you have that one? I did give that one to you. Yeah, that's right. He's got that one on there. And this was after the Alabama-Auburn game. This one ended up everywhere. I think it was on SEC Network too. So it was pretty much everywhere. And Texas A&M had a little bit of trouble with us. I'm going to need a bigger boat. By the way, I saw Chancellor Jones not long ago, and I said to him, since y'all are tight with Katy Perry, and I know there's a couple shark suits lying around, that maybe you ought to see if you can get a bid on the left shark. That would be a cool mascot. And I would fill it too, because I dance just like the left shark, so that would work out very well. Okay, the French, and that was a good question, I guess, to go back to the French cartoon. And it was funny, that morning, my phone went off as I'm driving in, and I'm very conscientious about texting and driving, not because I can't do it, because I can't, but also can't see the phone because I'm 47 years old. But I saw it was a message from one of the local TV reporters, and I didn't know what it was about. And so I turned on the radio, and they said that 4 cartoonists had been slaughtered, murdered, because they had the audacity to actually speak their mind and try to print their opinion. And I have to admit, it did kind of give me a little bit of a chill, because, you kind of start looking over your shoulder when something like that happens. And this was actually before I drew this like in 5 minutes and put it up. But those guys were more South Park than I am. That would be more the type of cartoons they draw. But at the end of the day, they gigged everybody, and they paid for it with their life. And usually that's one thing I've noticed, that whenever tyrants go after people, they usually go after the humorists and people that, because honestly, people pay attention to that. And I've always said that, and I watched my cousin, Dave Ramsey, the financial guy, who makes quite a bit of money, but he made finances entertaining. And I think if you can take any topic and you can make it fun and you can make it entertaining, even if it's a wicked point that needs to be made, people are going to listen to you. And that's what scares those guys, because they know that people listen to them. Katy Perry. This was just had the Chris McDaniel, Thad Cochran thing, which I guess I should give a percentage of my royalties to Chris McDaniel.
He's one of your favorites.
There for last year, it was like every third day something would come up, so it was great.
The gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, the candidate loses but refuses to concede. A preacher claims the candidates. I mean, it was just, John Grisham had come with that story. His editors would look at, no, John, nobody's going to believe that for a second. So, this one, this was one of the first ones I did on McDaniel. This one really honkered him off. And it's funny because of Twitter now. I love Twitter. I mean, I'm a big fan of Twitter, and I love it. And I know Ross Bjork and I are real tight on Twitter. That's a real good moment, which is great. We've already been to IKEA and picked up furniture, so we've made up. But it's a wonderful, powerful tool, because you get instant feedback and communication with people, and it's a great brand building tool too, to be honest with you. And I think that's, as journalism progresses into the 21st century, that's more and more important for every person who practices it, to have that personal brand. And I don't mean go out and sell yourself, but I mean to be able to have, when people see your name, they know what you stand for, and that's a great tool to be able to do it. And but this one was great. I mean, it just got people hunkered off. And the weird thing about it was, I think I've drawn Thad Cochran like 3 times in 20 years. And then over the last, because he's so under the radar. And so, Trent was the one you drew, Trent Lott, because he was the one that was out front. So Thad, I had to really work on his caricature. I'm not even sure I ever got it down. But here's him singing, Did It My Way. The possum became a very popular feature in the cartoons. And it was really funny, because after I started drawing the possum, I have a dog named Pip, and Pip has her own Twitter account also, and because she's like that. And so one morning I let her out because she wanted to go out at 2 in the morning, and she started raising Cain. And I think, oh great, somebody's in the backyard. Well, a little baby possum had gotten up on a soccer ball, cornered, and Pip was trying to eat her. So I pulled Pip back, and I took a picture, of course, naturally, because I thought, hey, there's great Instagram fodder right there. Took a picture of the possum, and Chris McDaniel commented on their curses foiled again. And I thought, wow, he has a sense of humor after all. This is going to be okay. So here's with Ricky Cole and Haley Barber. That was an actual quote. That's what. See, really, that's the beauty about Mississippi. Your life is very easy here. My first pardon. I love casinos. I don't know what a casino is. I took Spanish. I think it's the feminine form of casino. I'm not sure. Here's him singing Let It Go. You haven't lived till you've been on a field trip with a 5th grader, and you hear 5th grade girls singing Let It Go for 400 miles. Yeah. I stabbed my eardrums out with a pencil. Just a few more of them here. Yeah, I don't think Melanie liked that one too much. This was one is in the paper, and I stole this off of Twitter. But this was fun because this was a list of all the people that Chris hated. And so I got all the Barbers in there. I got Haley, Austin, Henry, anyone named Barber, and the Barber of Seville, which I thought was nice. And this stupid cartoonist. Here's preparing for the Purge star. Michael Watson's wife texted me and said that I've been trying to get him to manscape, and maybe that cartoon will help. I'm like, I don't really want to get into your marriage. That's fine. And legislative session, how it's like American Idol. I've always said that, the first bills that come into a session are completely insane. It's kind of like the beginning of American Idol when people can't sing, but you watch it because it's a car wreck. And then toward the end, of course, most of the ones that pass are insane too, but there we go. This was yesterday's, I think. Bill Denny. Bill Denny once had a very good quote to me. He said, every time you draw me, I get 10 more votes. So he loved him. I draw him, and so now 20 years later, I'm still drawing him. And I'm not really saying that Bill Denny's the Walking Dead, but, it might be a little bit there. Congressman Nunley passed away, and this was the obit cartoon. Obit cartoons are something that a lot of cartoonists don't like to do. I do just mainly, honestly, because I have 365 days a year to be a jerk, and every once in a while, I think somebody deserves a little bit of respect. And Congressman Nunley, just take the politics out of it, I always liked Alan. And I liked Alan because, and this is why I liked Alan. We were both down at the Perdido Key Resort down in Alabama on the coast. He was speaking, I was speaking. I was there with my family, he was there with his family, and he was there in a loud Hawaiian shirt. This was last summer. Loud Hawaiian shirt, black socks, looked like a typical tourist playing with his kids. He wasn't holding court. He wasn't having people kiss his rings. He was being a granddad. And, I think sometimes in politics, and I love politics, and I love going after people, but I always like the sheepdog and coyote version of politics, where you clock out at the end of the day, and you're back to being human. And I think that's kind of what I always found about Alan, that he was, at the end of the day, he was human. And he had a friend of mine's brother's retinas also in his eyes. So I always thought that was a neat story, too. This was Brian Williams, News Hawk down. He shot down his own helicopter. Just remember this, folks. Whenever you get caught doing something, make sure that you apologize and apologize well, because it's always what the follow-up that kills you. It's not the actual scandal itself. This one went everywhere for teachers. And then 4 years after All right, this is the beginning. So, I mentioned that I did the cartoon in high school. When I got to University of Tennessee, and this is something that I know probably, since this is a packed room, most of you have some kind of dream. And I had a dream. At 8 years old, I loved Jeff McNelly, and I loved Pat Oliphant, and I loved Mad Magazine. And all the stuff that Curtis was covering, we were sitting around the dinner table talking about, because we lived in Georgia, and he was down covering Jimmy Carter. And of course, Jimmy Carter had been our governor, and we knew about Billy Carter and Miss Lillian. And it was just a great time for politics. Watergate had just gotten over. And I mean, and we lived I have two older sisters. One works for the CDC, one's a teacher. In fact, her son goes to school here. He was just in, but he said, I've heard you before, so he cut out. And no, I'm kidding, he had a class. But the point is, I loved the editorial cartoons I saw as a kid. I was a weird kid. I loved playing sports and all that, but I loved seeing the cartoons. I said, I want to do this. So when I got to college, I went to go see my advisor, and her name was Gail Palmer, I think. I'm not sure. I may be wrong on that. And Gail, she wasn't trying to be discouraging, but she just said, well, they've got a cartoonist at the paper. And I looked at her and I said, okay. So I walked downstairs and beat out their cartoonist and was the cartoonist for the Daily Beacon for 5 years. And we're not really going to get into the details why it was 5 years. It probably technically should have been 4, but I had this clairvoyance to realize that we were going to have a really good football season that 5th year, so I wanted to hang around. That and I switched majors, and so it took me a little bit longer to get out of college. But that was the greatest experience. I go back now, and I literally drop to my knees and do this whenever I go to the Daily Beacon student newspaper, because that is where I learned the discipline to do what I do. Curtis knows, the worst thing in the world, it could be a deadline. And y'all get that all the time, whether it's you're doing a paper or you're doing an article or anything you're doing. And you've got to learn that facing a deadline's no more scary than facing brushing your teeth. You know you got to do it. So I did 5 cartoons a day for 5 years. And that taught me the discipline and got a lot of bad cartoons out of my system. That cartoon right there on the far left, Reese's Believe It or Not, that was the chancellor of University of Tennessee. I know this may shock you, but University of Tennessee didn't have good parking. I know y'all have got great parking, and I know you've got that all fixed. And I know they fixed it at Tennessee because of that cartoon, too. That was my last cartoon right there. That one was in Best Editorial Cartoons of the Year. There's me, I guess at the age of 22. I've changed. I dip myself in formaldehyde daily, so I really don't look much different. But that was it, and that's where I got my training. And if I didn't have that experience, I couldn't do what I do, and it was great. And so when I graduated, I knew I was going to be the New York Times' next editorial cartoonist. Of course, the New York Times hadn't had an editorial cartoonist since before the 20th century, but that's okay. I just knew I was going to make it. And my dad is Dave Ramsey, the guy that Dave Ramsey's named after. And so Dad said, well, you better be ready to move back home. And I said, oh, Dad, I've got this. Don't worry. There's me graduating. That's the dean looking at me saying, oh, you're going to have to get a real job someday. No, it was so cute. I almost had a chin, too. And then this happened. I graduated and fulfilled my dad's worst nightmares and became a janitor at Pope High School in Marietta, Georgia. Wasn't exactly on the 5-year career plan, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I always call it my 5th year in high school. I graduated with honors from Tennessee in May, and by July I was working cleaning up toilets. And I'd even Xeroxed my diploma and put it on my barrel. And so, I threw the most awesome pity party ever. How many of you have ever thrown a really good pity party? And I had snacks. That's how good mine was. And I'll tell you about a pity party. The only person who enjoys a good pity party is the person who's throwing it, because nobody wanted to be around me. I was like, it was bad. I was like Pigpen. I had a little clap. In fact, I kind of looked like this, most of the time. 6 months into it, I went to church, which I highly recommend. I do it twice a year, whether I need to or not. And they were talking about the parable of the talents. And if y'all aren't familiar with that, you have the three servants, and the master goes away, gives them 1 10, 1 5, 1 1 talent. And I had been given a talent, and I was like that one guy. He was afraid, and he buried the talent, and the master comes back and is completely angry. And for 6 months, I hadn't been drawing. I hadn't been using this ability I've got. So I'm like, it was like an epiphany. It was one of those moments where I say, okay, I got to get a better attitude. I got to get to work. I came back the next day with a smile on my face, which confused everybody. And they're like, who is this guy? What happened to Marshall? Are you on drugs? They were just checking on that. They pricked my finger and did a drug test, took a lock of my hair. And you know what was amazing? Doors started opening at that point. One of the ladies I worked with said, you know what? You got the best attitude. I've got a friend at the local newspaper. I'm going to get you a job as an advertising artist. And within a few months, I was working at the local paper as an advertising artist. And another lady I worked with named Maggie, and I love Maggie. Maggie came up to me and said, you know what? You're a nice guy. How'd you like to go out with my daughter? And I said, man, your standards for your daughter are pretty low. They really are. But when I saw her, she had the prettiest blue eyes I'd ever seen in my life. And if I hadn't had that worst moment, and I guess I'm telling you this because there's going to be moments when you think you're going to do great and you're going to fall flat on your face. And I'm telling you right now that the best stuff's going to come from that. Because if I hadn't have been cleaning up toilets, I wouldn't be sitting here in this chair right now. Because it gave me the incentive and it gave me the fire to chase my dream and do what I wanted to do. That's that girl, by the way. Because out of that worst moment, I got the 4 best moments. I got to see her come down the aisle, and I got 3 boys that looked just like her, thank God. So it worked out okay. That's Amy, by the way. And she, I don't know how she puts up with me, 20 years. Banjo's Dream, this is a little side project. This is a children's book, but and I threw him in here just because Banjo was a farty rescue dog we had, and I say farty because that's all he ever did. And but when he was 10, he started going outside a lot and drinking a lot, and not drinking, although he probably would do that too. But he had diabetes, and so at age 10, I started giving this stupid dog shots twice a day because I didn't want to teach my kids that my dogs were disposable. So this dog lived 4.5 years with more will to live than any person I'd ever met. So one night he had pancreatitis, he was about to die, and the vet called me at 3:30 in the morning and said, "You're gonna have to come over here, we're about to say goodbye to Banjo." So I laid on the table like a big baby crying because this dog's about to die, and I said, lifted his ear and I said, "If you beat this, I'll write the check." And that dog walked out of there 3 days later. And I wrote the biggest check I've ever written in my life. So I had to do a children's book to pay for his vet bills on that. But the one thing I discovered, though, about Mississippi, and I love Mississippi, and just like Curtis loves Mississippi, and we both probably get equally frustrated over it at times, and y'all get frustrated too. Per capita, we have the most talented kids in this state that I've ever seen. You judge the Scholastic Arts contest, and you will be blown away at the talent. What we lack is the belief that we can do great things. So I did this for kids, because banjos, I love this right here, all of our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them, Walt Disney. Walt Disney had another quote, "Come to my park and I'll charge you $13 for a hamburger." That's one of his other quotes. But I point to this for the kids, every one of those books on that shelf, written by a Mississippian. That's powerful. I was trying to see if Curtis is on there, and by God, I may have left you off, Curtis. I apologize. Okay, next slide. These are just a few of them. Banjo's an astronaut. Banjo's a quarterback. If y'all want him this year, you can have him. He's great. He would do a good job. Jim Cantori is friends of mine on Twitter. Don't ask me why. He saw this. He wanted to get a copy of it. And if Jim Cantori walked in the back of that room right now, what would y'all do? Run, right? Because we'd have an EF5 hurricane coming toward us, right? Not an EF5 tornado, we'd have an EF5 hurricane. So he's kind of the angel of death. But he wanted this, so I made him go to Nebraska to meet me, and we gave it to him, and Nebraska was destroyed the next day. So it worked out very well. These are just a few cartoons that I do on Facebook. I do some of these. I feel for Jimmy. I hope he finds his shaker of salt. I know he's looking for it, but $500 billion later, he probably can. My parents had an attic fan. I love that thing because it was an air conditioner. It was a fan from a DC-3 up an engine up in there in the ceiling, and turn that thing on, and it would always scare the cats and suck them into the ceiling. How we learn geography in the South. True story, I moved here, we had a tornado warning the first day I moved here, and I didn't know where I lived. So I opened up the window to hear the freight train, because that's, they always pull the guy out of the rubble and he says, "Sound freight train!" He's always yelling because he's deaf. When I lived in Houston, a guy got hit by a train, no kidding, he survived in his car, and he was being interviewed, and they asked him, "So sir, what was it like?" He said, "It sounded like a tornado." And I thought, that is the most awesome moment ever. This cartoon was shared on Facebook within 24 hours over 100,000 times. I'm not kidding you. And I did this in the Downton Abbey. They killed off one of the characters. I drew this within 5 minutes. And before I knew it, Anne Rice had it on her page. George Takei had it on his. I bet even Kanye would have put it on his page. That's how popular it was. It was everywhere.
They're about to kill off the dog, I understand.
I know it. I may have to come up with a sequel for that one. Yeah, you don't mess with dogs. I'm still mad about Old Yeller. I really am. The Bachelor. They put them on dream dates. I'm going to get back to editorials in a second, but these are just a few. If you want to find out if you love somebody, take down wallpaper. Trust me. You installed the deer whistles backwards. Don't you love the I-55 at night going down toward Jackson? It's like driving through a petting zoo, right? And also, too, the truck stop in Winona, 10 o'clock at night, bar scene from Star Wars. It's awesome. Good stuff. It'd be pretty if it wasn't pollen. All right, now, sometimes these cartoons have unintended consequences. This is Earl's disappointed to learn about the open carry laws about guns, but he says his beer's a Colt 45. So I'm in Whataburger down in Jackson. A guy taps me on the back, all right? So I'm getting a little nervous because you never know what that's going to bring. He says, "Are you Marshall Ramsey?" And I'm like, "Oh, God. Yes? I like your cartoons." "Oh, good. But," oh, no. I tense back up again. And he said, "I don't like the cartoons you draw with the guy named Earl." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you make Earl look stupid." And I said, "Let me guess, your name is Earl." His name was Earl. And he was mad about it, legitimately. So I bought him a biscuit, and we went down, sat down, and talked it out. And so from that point on, I draw Earl to look just like the guy in Whataburger. And there he is right there. So every time you see Earl, it's that guy from Whataburger. And I don't know why that Earl from Whataburger would have a portrait of Phil Bryant on his wall. I have no idea. But it's a particularly scary one of Phil Bryant. And it's like Phil Bryant's looking over you to make sure you're behaving. It's really funny because most cartoonists never meet the people they draw, ever. Here, you go to lunch, they're there. And it is really, I've had some great conversations over the years from people. When I first took the job here, I lived in San Diego, and the first thing I did is I went to the public library in San Diego, and I checked out a book on Medgar Evers. And there was a reason, because number one, I've always thought that Medgar Evers was one of the most courageous human beings ever on the planet, to think what he did. And number two, I had done a lot of research on the Clarion-Ledger, its history, its past, and the cartoonists from the past. And one of them was named Bob Howie, and I'd met Bob through the phone, and I was supposed to meet Bob in person, but I had surgery for cancer, and he was in town, and then he left town, and then he died, and I missed getting to meet him. But there were a lot of cartoons that were done during the 50s and 60s that were particularly offensive, and particularly offensive for African Americans. And I knew that I was going to come here, and that was going to be a legacy that I was going to deal with in some form or fashion. And it just is what it is, But what I didn't want to do is I didn't want to be, I just didn't want to be intentionally offensive. I don't mean being offensive, but I didn't want to be stereotypically offensive because I think that's lazy, I think it's cheap, and I think it's stupid. And but it's brought us some great conversations because when I make fun of everybody. I mean, that's what I do. And I try to make fun of everybody equally. I try to be fair in my unfairness, if there's any sense to that whatsoever, very little. And it's been over 20 years for the most part. I've had a few people complain, but for the most part, it's been good. And it's really opened up some great conversations. But it's just something that, and I am very good friends with the cartoonist in the Chicago Tribune named Scott Stannis. And Scott was the cartoonist of the Birmingham News. And he and I talk about this just for hours on, that when you're doing cartoons, it's not a question of being sensitive, it's just being right, and being correct. And so, but I've always loved this cartoon just because I just respect Medgar so much. And I got to meet Merle back at an editorial board, and she talked about drinking formaldehyde. Good grief, she looks like she's about 50 years old. And she's just an amazing soul. And to have the courage that she's had, but to me it was such an honor to get to meet her just for that fact. So it's interesting. This is cartoon numero uno. This was the first cartoon I ever drew here in Mississippi. Let me tell you how I got here. Didn't think I'd end up here. The only time I came through Mississippi was driving on the way to Texas, and I got my rock through my windshield, which I know it's shock y'all, because that never happens here in Mississippi. We never get rock dings. I mean, it's our hidden tax. But I got a call from a guy named Dan Turner. Dan Turner is an Ole Miss grad. Dan is from Philadelphia, Mississippi, and he was my editor in Conroe, Texas. And when I lived out in San Diego, he said, "Marshall, the cartoonist Mark Bolton has left the Clarion-Ledger. You would be perfect for Mississippi." And I'd just gotten back from the beach. And I said, "Dan, no." He said, "No, seriously." He was like green eggs and ham. He kept calling me over and over and over. He said, "Would you like it with a goat? Would you like it in a boat?" I was like, "No." And but he kept after me, and I remember flying in. It was such a surreal interview. Imagine this. I'm coming over the Ross Barnett Reservoir at night. There's nothing out that way at that time in the mid-90s. It's dark, I see water, the landing gear's going down. I put on the life vest, the flight attendant tells me to stop because I'm scaring the other passengers. A guy that I had worked with from Texas, not Dan, but somebody else, picks me up at the airport, takes me by Applebee's and says, if you're not going to get the job, you'll eat here. You'll go to Shapley's, which is a nice steak place, if you're going to get the job. They put me at a hotel 1 block away that had dirty sheets, so I had to get new sheets. I turn on City Council TV and watch that. I see Governor Fordyce doing something Governor Fordyce like. They have an editorial board meeting with a congressman. I'm not going to say which one it was. And one of our editorial board meetings gets in a verbal altercation with the congressman. It was awesome. And they put me in a 74 Buick, a guy named Joe White that was the copy editor who was he looked kind of like, I guess like Colonel Sanders, but he was just a really fantastic guy. And he took me back to the airport by the old Gold Coast in a private prison in a 74 Buick with grass growing in the back of it. And I get back to San Diego and my wife's like, well, what'd you think? I said, honey, I never saw it in the daylight. And I didn't. Because I remember they drove me past UMC and they said, this is a great place to go if you're ever shot. I'm like, this is not a Chamber of Commerce moment, all right? I'm not one, and I don't know why I came here. Until I really started thinking about it, it was the people that I'd met. I mean, I fell in love with the people in Mississippi. It was literally love at first sight. And I've been blessed for 20 years to be able to travel to every section of the state and speak and get to meet folks. And it's just amazing. But that was the first cartoon. That was December 17th, 1996. And, I used to do it 7 days a week. I'm now part-time, so I do it less. But it's still pretty amazing. We had voter ID pass, and this is how voter ID works in my neighborhood. How's your mama and them? Oh yeah, let me see your ID. This is no kidding. I walked in there one time when the lady said, your light was on last night, are you sick? I'm like, okay, and then you want to see my ID, so. We had the flooding up in the Delta, and Al Roker was in Vicksburg. And Al was standing in about 6 inches of water, because that's what you do when you're a national TV reporter in a flood. And he was in a spot where I'd seen about a 12-foot alligator. And I'm thinking, great, Al's going to get eaten on national television. And, it's not going to be a Chamber of Commerce moment there either. But luckily, I think the alligator preferred the old Al to the new Al. But that was good. This was one from the Scruggs indictment. Actually, this was in, I think, part of the court papers. I was so touched. Freight train. That's such a great Southern saying. This is Frank Melton. Frank Melton, the mayor of Jackson. Frank was a television executive who owned WLBT, and he was a very good manager in that respect when he owned the TV station, because he basically hired good people and let them do it, and then Frank ran out and did whatever Frank wanted to do. When he became mayor, he became to think that he was Batman. So this was his obituary cartoon when he died the night of the election. He was about to lose the election and he died. Some people say he didn't die. I'm not kidding you, but yeah, he did pass away. And here's him. He liked to knock down houses and do all kinds of unconstitutional things. He busted the strip clubs. So he busted strip clubs. He wore a badge like that. So eventually I turned the badges into pasties. And then he said, hug me. But I'm not kidding you. The strippers at one of the strip clubs, and now granted, if I want to see scars, I'll take off my own shirt. But they offered me the honor of that if I ever came in, they would give me free drinks. And I was so touched. The perks of being a cartoonist. Here's him with his pasties. Has your day job ever gotten in the way? Here's him with the Constitution. Because he had the mobile command center, so when they got this helicopter, I thought, well, it would be great. I know this shocks y'all, but I get phone calls occasionally from people that get offended. And this one offended a few people, and that was fine. I've actually lost 50 pounds myself, so I like fried things. They're very friendly and they're very tasty. But this cartoon, one lady just called me up and just chewed me out. And I finally looked at her and I said, ma'am, it's okay. It's not scratch and sniff. And she went, oh, click, and hung up on me. And I'm like, I'll have to try that one more often. So, Governor Barber, you know, somebody once told me that you're only as good as your governor. I have been pretty lucky. I've had some really good governors. Haley, once I figured out that Haley looked like Fred Flintstone, I started getting his caricature down. And the thing I like about Haley, and Curtis and I both agree on this, Haley's a great guy to talk to. He's very friendly, and obviously you don't get to be one of the top lobbyists on the planet without having the personal touch, and Haley really does have that gift. Haley also has a good sense of humor about cartoons for the most part. He told me early on, he said, I want you to draw me with a thin pen. Of course, I had to speed that up to understand him, but he basically was pretty good about things. And the funny thing is, and I heard this through a relative of his, that he had the gap in his teeth fixed after I was drawing him with the gap in his teeth. He never noticed it before until I started drawing him with that gap. So here's him. This is when he was thinking about running for president. Marshall, I want to thank you for inviting me to New Hampshire. He says, hi, guys, you know. And then, what's a casino? Who knows? All right, Fordyce. Ancient history, but wow, this is Jesse Ventura, the man who sued Chris Kyle's widow. What a guy, Jesse Ventura. And of course, here's Fordyce with the beret and Bert Case. Bert Case is the legendary, longtime news anchor reporter and said he went to school with you. I did not realize that. Yeah. He once strapped himself to a tree during Hurricane Camille, and fought off pit bulls, and he fought off Governor Fordyce. Governor Fordyce had gotten caught coming off a plane, so Bert goes out to his house, and he says, didn't have to say anything. Fordyce came out in a T-shirt and said, I'm going to whip your... Well, he didn't. He said the whole thing. And so it ends up on the Today Show. I have cartoonists calling me saying I'm the luckiest SOB on the planet, and gave me some of the best cartoons ever. So I gave him a little beret just as an afterthought, and it really kind of took off. Here's him with Bert right here, day one of Fordyce's retirement. As Bert comes around the corner, and somebody stuck this on my desk, and it said day two of Fordyce's retirement, and they glued my picture on there. He used to actually walk past my window every day with a gun and his dog and a guard. The governor did. And I finally got nervous, and my editor at the time was David Hampton. So I put a sign up in my window that said Marshall Ramsey's office with an arrow, and I pointed it toward David's office. Because I figured if Kirk was going to open fire, that he was going to take out my boss, and then I could run. So there's him during the flood. I heard from one of his aides that he used to sit there over the paper and scream, why? Why does he draw my face like this? Why? And it just, once I found that out, it kind of made me keep doing it, because I'm a little bit of a sixth grader sometimes. So he died, and he died of leukemia, the same type of leukemia my grandmother passed away from. And when I found out he had it, I knew he had a battle, and I just said, hey, from one cancer survivor to another, I hope you have a, I hope you beat this, and I'm pulling for you and I'm praying for you. And he wrote me back a very thoughtful note, and I cherish that because he died 2 weeks later. And, I know Fordyce, this according to his son, he said, that old man hated the cartoons, but he thought you were good at what you did. And I respect that, And I always tell people, when people get mad at me about cartoons, and they do, or they get mad at me about tweets, and they do, or they get mad at me about Facebook, I don't care. Because, I've been married 21 years, and you saw she's a pretty girl, and she's pretty, very pretty. She and I don't agree half the time, and she married me. And if somebody comes up to me and says, I agree with you 100% of the time, I run, because they're going for my wallet. I just don't, it doesn't bother me when people disagree with me, because we all grow up and live in different worlds, and we walk a different walk, and we have a different journey. I had malignant melanoma. I had 3 doctors miss it. I shouldn't be here. I feel like I have a debt to pay. So that makes me live a different life than maybe somebody else. I grew up middle class in Marietta, Georgia, at a high school that was 90% white, 10% African American. That made me see the world differently. I grew up Presbyterian Methodist, now I'm Episcopalian. I see the world differently. That's just how it goes. And so when people disagree with me, I usually take it with a grain of salt. And then I tell them they're wrong. So it works out. But this one, this one, I got a lot of calls. People said I was scum because there's a rule in the South that you only say nice things about people when they die. So like, for instance, Satan dies, and he says, the devil had a way of warming up a room. And so I had a lot of people call and just said how disrespectful I was for this cartoon. And then Pat Fordyce called and said, Marshall, the family loves the cartoon and they want the original. We want the original to hang in his office for a memorial. So I gave her that and called everybody else up and went, that had called. So Ronnie Musgrove came along. I thought, gosh, I thought he was going to be boring, to be honest with you. And about 35 minutes after the House elected him, because, he and Mike Parker, it was a tie and had to go to the House. And 35 minutes after they elected him, he made everybody mad. So it was great because I had all these great cartoons. And, the funny thing about him was he had this distinctive voice, and it was hard to catch it. But Curtis and I were talking about Gary Trudeau, who does Doonesbury, and he, they were on the tour bus, they were on the campaign bus together, and Gary always would go to events and catch people's personalities. And I think when you're doing a good caricature of somebody, number one rule, and this is from Jack Davis of Mad Magazine, he said, number one, you look at their eyes. If you get their eyes straight, you're going to do a good caricature. That's because when I talk to you, or if I talk to you, or if I talk to you, I look in the eye. And if I'm looking somewhere else, you're going to feel uncomfortable. So that was rule number one. But number two, you always try to get their mannerisms and their so forth. So with Ronnie, it was just kind of like you kind of had this lankiness, kind of out of control character in the nose and everything. And he really made for a good caricature. Mike Moore was our attorney general for a long time. And Mike always used to complain about how I drew his hair. So every time he complained, I made it worse. He said, oh, you drew my hair too tall today. So he ended up looking like Marge Simpson. And that's kind of rule number one in the cartoon world. If you complain, I make it worse. Best hate call ever on this cartoon. Best one. Because of that lady right there on the far left. I got a call from a lady, I guess she was from New Albany. And she said, Marshall, you drew that lady right there naked. And I said, ma'am, she's wearing a two-top and you have a dirty mind. Oh, click. And she hung up. She was so mad at me on that, but, seriously. Okay, this is a good example of the eye thing that I was telling you about. I love Clinton. It's just fun. Bill Clinton's look on there. He always looks like he's up to something because he usually is. Now, I got to tell you this. When we lived out in San Diego, we would get invited to parties because we sounded Southern, right? I don't sound Southern, but they thought we did. So they had food, and I don't know about y'all, but I like free food. I'm really big on that. And so they would invite us, and they're like, oh, you sound so much like Bill Clinton. I'm like, no, I really don't. And they're like, we have free shrimp. And I'd be like, I'm sorry, Hillary, I lied. I didn't mean to. And they'd flick a shrimp to me like I was, Shamu. When I was in college, Dad Bush came to UT, and that was kind of a neat experience. As a journalist, I got to cover that, and that was my first experience around a press, the big press pool and the Secret Service and the presidential entourage and all that good stuff. And it was just something, I said, I want to do this. It was electric. I was excited on that. And I remember getting to get fairly close to the president and so forth. But when I started drawing, he was really the first president because I came in right at the end of Reagan when I started my career. He was the first one that I drew, and that was kind of how I drew him. When W came along, I couldn't nail his caricature. I had the hardest time drawing him, and I couldn't figure out what it was. It was because I couldn't get his eyes right? So, and once again, number one rule, you got to get the eyes right. So I'm sitting there doing it. So I just looked at his dad, who doesn't really look like, but he kind of looks like him. And then I looked at W, and then I looked at his dad, and then I looked at W, and I took his dad's eyes and put them on W, and it clicked. And that was all it took. And it's funny because sometimes you'll just sit there and struggle. President Obama, I mean, that was one of the first tries at him. He's pretty easy. I can nail him pretty well. Some people get really crazy with the ears and all that, so forth, but I try to, keep pretty close. Carter, I should be able to draw better. And, everybody used to draw him so well, but I've never been able to draw Jimmy Carter for some reason. I've met him 2 or 3 times, and I still can't draw the guy. So I don't know. But this is just one of my favorite pieces of art, just because it was so much fun to do all the caricatures. I drew this on the day we actually had layoffs at the newspaper, and I about got laid off myself that day. That was a rough day, but it wasn't because of that. It was just because the economy was tanking. It was, in fact, I remember the presidential debate we had here at Ole Miss, which was fantastic. Oh my gosh! I mean, it was a political junkie's dream being up here. And I remember driving home that night from it, and coming back, and I'm on, somewhere near Grenada, and they're talking about the paper market freezing up and talking about how the world economy is going off the rails. And at that point, everybody started laying off. And the newspaper business has changed a lot since I've been into it. If you're interested in journalism and you want to go into it right now, I cannot say that I will say that you're going into one of the most interesting periods probably in the profession's history. And if I were you, I'd be very excited about it. I've seen 3 babies being born, my kids. That was the most frightening and inspiring thing I've ever seen in my life, combination. And that's kind of what's going on with journalism. I have a marketing degree. I'm in journalism. I've studied and I'm a 2-time Pulitzer finalist. I've had my career upended. I've had it thrown against the wall. I've had it beat with a stick. And everything that's happened has somehow led to something cooler and more interesting. I've gotten to the point now, I was fired a couple of years ago from one of my radio shows, and I looked at him and said, thank you, because I knew it was going to lead to something better, and it did. And it's one of those things that if you come into it with the ability to be a storyteller, the ability to have a good brand, the ability to have the core principles of journalism, and you have your eyes wide open and are willing to do anything and try anything, you're going to have more fun than you've ever had in your life. Because in the last 4 years, I was made part-time in 2010. I thought that was a terrible thing, and it has opened up adventures that I never thought I'd ever have. And people always tell me that, what? I said, no, it was good. Because we are in a very exciting time. Now, granted, the big wigs are still trying to figure out how to monetize stuff, and that's tough, but it has been a blessing. So yeah, I don't worry about these sort of things anymore. I just say bring it on. This is the Frog Armpit Odor Research Center, paid for by the stimulus bill. They, in Mississippi, they shut down all the bathrooms on the interstate with the stimulus money, which is very dangerous when you have 3 little boys and you hear, Daddy, I gotta pee. So they were. King of Spain came to Mississippi, and he stepped aside, by the way. I thought I'm sure Prince Charles was cutting that clipping out, giving it to his mom. But he came, and they put a big sign up and said, Mississippi welcomes the king. And my first thought was, that ain't Elvis. And my second thought was, I'll be playing golf by 1. So it worked out pretty well. There's Banjo, by the way. He's making a cameo there. The worst moments in the life thing I mentioned that day when I heard the cancer thing. And boy, that was a shock. And that kind of set me into a tough thing. And it kind of opened up a new part of my career to where I've been able to go and talk to a lot of cancer survivors. And one of the things that I've discovered over the years is called hope. Just when I go, this is how I got through it. This was humor, opportunity to serve, physical well-being, and educate yourself. My parents took me to the beach after the cancer. And of course I had malignant melanoma, which is a very deadly form of skin cancer. So they took me to Destin. I'm still trying to figure that one out. I'm like, if you want to shoot me by a gun, Dad, it's cheaper. So they're all out having fun outside. I'm in watching Dr. Phil. About 6 o'clock rolls around. I take my shirt off. I go running into the water. And this lady and her 2 little girls are staring at me like I'm the freak of the week. And I'm looking at her, and they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them. And I point to my scar, because I've got a scar on my back about that long where they carved out, to make sure I wouldn't die. And I just pointed at it, and she nodded. And I said, it's okay. It was a shark attack. And it happened right where your little girls are swimming. She grabbed her kids, and she ran out of the water. It was awesome. I learned something that day. When bad stuff happens, and it's going to happen, is you can learn to laugh at it, you'll be a lot better off. And that has been a huge philosophy of mine ever since then. That's why when I had the change in my job, I laughed. And I said, why? They said, why are you laughing? I said, this is going to be awesome. And it's all about the attitude, and it's been huge. This was the toughest cartoon I've ever had to draw. Oh, give you a second to enjoy that. That morning, it was 9/11. We were in the kitchen. I had a little baby at the time, Daniel, who's 14 now. It's hard to believe. My wife and I were bickering about something. And we had the little white TV in the kitchen, and all suddenly, the Good Morning America was on, or one of them, and, the World Trade Center is on fire. And I just said to Amy, Amy, this isn't good, because the only plane that I know of that's ever hit a building there is a B-25, and that was in fog, and it was a beautiful day. I said, something's up. And we both sat there and watched the second plane come in. And the horror unfolded, and I'm sitting there thinking in the back of my mind, oh my God, I'm going to have to draw something. I don't know what I'm going to draw. So I went into work. Everybody's driving 50 miles an hour down I-55. I remember gas was $1.35 a gallon. Just these little things you remember. I remember seeing the planes starting to come into Jackson. I get down to the paper. We're going to do an extra edition. That was back in the day. And I knew I was going to have to do something pretty quickly. And I just was like one of those moments, God, just give me an idea, please. It wasn't an on my knees moment, but it was just a kind of a, I just was stunned like everybody else. How do you comment on something when you're speechless, And the first tower had fallen, and the second tower fell. And they showed the iconic shot of the Statue of Liberty standing proudly before the smoke. And I said, and I drew that. And several other cartoonists actually did very similar cartoons too. I guess it was kind of a no-brainer kind of moment. Chicken Soup for the Soul, for the 9/11 soul. That book, we used this cartoon. It appeared in a couple of the New York papers. I had over 1,000 emails on it. Some of the 9/11 cartoons are actually in the Freedom Forum. They asked for them, and I donated them to that. I look back now at the cartoons that I did. It was literally for about 2 or 3 weeks. I talk about you laugh at the moments that you are scared. Well, I couldn't laugh because it was just so horrific. Of course, I look now at that, and there's a silver lining on that cloud. I didn't really mean for it to happen at the time, but I think about how we came together as a country, and I felt like that was a pretty amazing time. This is probably my favorite cartoon. This was the first year as a Pulitzer finalist was this and some flag vote cartoons. And this took 6 hours to draw. And my process is kind of been compressed now because of my short time at work, but this took 6, and this is probably my favorite all-time cartoon that I've done. I just like the sentiment. People always say, well, we're not like that anymore, but here in Mississippi in August 29, 2005, it was one of those moments too where it was, I remember we were in the newsroom, and in Jackson at the Clarion-Ledger, there's a big building across the street called Capitol Towers, and they have a parking garage that has a metal facade on it that whistles when the wind gets above a certain, 60 miles, 40, 50 miles an hour, it starts whistling, and it started whistling. And it was like, okay, this is getting serious, because people are like, it's another hurricane. And then we got the news report that there was water coming in on the second floor of the Beau Rivage. And we knew at that point that the world was going to change, that the coast was never going to be quite the same, and it hasn't been. And so I had to draw. I drew a cartoon really quick, drove home, nearly got squished by 2 trees. That was fun. But some of these cartoons from Katrina mean the most to me because I did a lot of work down on the coast, not just as a journalist, but also with my church. And, my number one job is not making fun of people or doing all the other junk I do. My number one job is raising my kids. And I'm trying to raise them in a place that I believe in. And when I see people from Mississippi step up and do the things that they did after Katrina, it was pretty darn inspiring, to be honest with you. And so these are a few of them. This was actually a drawing that I did, just a pen and ink drawing. I was down working, and 6 people died in the scene. Where that truck is, that used to be a carport. And there were 2 people that stayed there, and they drowned. And then there were 4 people that lived behind them that stayed, and they drowned. And, that people say it was Camille's last victims, but a lot of people had stayed because they'd survived Camille. and then they got washed away because the storm surge was that much higher. And we were actually helping a guy look for his wife's ring, her wedding ring. And she had been doing dishes. She had taken her ring off and set it, on the sink and was doing that, and the water started coming in, and they evacuated. And so we were on our hands and knees sifting through the muck looking for a ring, provincial, this proverbial needle in the haystack. And he stopped and he told me about this, so I said, okay. So I drew that as quick as I could. I think that was a pretty fast drawing. And I came back about a year later for a book signing, and somebody said, yeah, I'm a neighbor of that guy, and they found that ring 2 weeks later. And that's always been one of my favorite Katrina stories, that they found that ring. That's what it looks like today. I go back down there. I draw it every 2 years. I draw the same spot. So just to kind of give a little piece of history on that. It's been one of the joys of being able to be a commentator here in Mississippi. For 20 years, I've now got a pretty good slice of watching how things have changed and so forth. And that was one of them. This image, Joe Rosenthal's photograph was one of the most iconic of the 20th century. And I would say easily it's one of the most beaten to death by a cartoonist. You see it for everything. But I'll tell you what, when the power came back on at our house, it was hope. Because, man, it was bad. I remember my son came up to me and said, Dad, I can't go to the bathroom. I said, why not? And he said, the power's out. I said, is your bladder electric? And he said, no, Dad, it's dark. I said, you've never hit the toilet before. What are you worried about? And so, but I mean, when the power truck came down the street, it was like the ice cream truck for adults. It's like, yay! And the lights came back on and we had hope. And so I've been blessed to know 2 or 3 Marines that were on EWO. And they talked about when that second flag went up on Mount Suribachi, that they thought they were going to die, but they thought, we're going to win. And so when the lights came back on after Katrina, that was like the moment when we knew we were going to win. All right, let's see. This is my book. Just to show you, I did a little bit of writing. I do some writing. This was a book I did. And these are just a few of the drawings from them, just pen and inks. That's Sherman invaded Atlanta today. Yeah, I grew up there, and I still go back over there because of family, and I renew my road rage license every 2 years. This was a Delta storm on that. There's a couple stories about crop dusters in there. So I grew up drawing airplanes, and I love doing that. Of course, this is DeSoto's idol, a tornado taking it out. This was a story called The Last D-Day, and this was actually a story that was inspired by a guy in my grandmother's nursing home who used to sit by himself in the corner, and he was in D-Day. And he just looked out the mountains and waited to die every day because he wanted to be with his friends again. And wrote a story based on that on the final D-Day. And so this was the art from it. I always said that, I used to believe that past the success looked like that. It's turned out looking more like that for me. It's been kind of crazy. And I guess that whatever success is, I don't even think it's to be. I think it's just whatever you're doing on the path. That's the success.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We've got time for a couple of questions.
Okay.
Question.
Right there in the front.
I have a question. Speaking of Charlie Hebdo, you're a cartoonist. Would you be, it's a two-part question. One, would you be willing to depict Muhammad in a cartoon? And two, following Hebdo, do you think that there will be more caution or censorship, or should there be, in political cartoon or satire cartoon?
I think you touched on probably the biggest.
Did everybody hear the question?
Two-part question, would I draw Muhammad? The second part was, do you think that there'll be more caution because of that? I think the biggest danger from it isn't the fact that cartoonists are going to die every 5 seconds. I think the biggest danger from that was the fact that self-censorship can start creeping into the picture, and I think that's very scary. As for me drawing Muhammad, believe me, I never would have ever done it in a million years probably before that. I'm probably more inclined to do it since then because, your first inclination is when somebody cuts you off in traffic, the first thing you want to do is flip them off, and that's kind of what it is on that. I do understand the sensitivity to, I don't care if I offend the guys that throw, that do that, the militants, the crazy guys. It's the people that are generally peaceful, that are practicing their religion. I don't want to flip them off. So that's why I didn't do it in the past, because it's to them, it's disrespectful. That's not my MO. The guys that are doing the shooting and everything else, if I piss them off, so what? I don't care, that. So I hope that's some kind of an answer. Yes?
After the issue about what happened at Paris,
Yes.
do you feel as if cartooning or journalism in general, do you think it will, I guess, blow up in a way? I mean, not,
That's kind of scary.
no pun
Yeah.
intended, I meant. But what do you think is the future for journalism and cartooning after Paris?
Well, I've kind of joked that I actually probably am more danger of by accountants than I am because of terrorists, to be honest with you, because there aren't many editorial cartoonists left anymore. When I approached my dad many years ago, said I was going to become a cartoonist, he looked at me and he said, "How many are there?" I said, "About 200. And he said, "I'll keep your room ready for you." Now there's probably 40, maybe 30 full-time practicing cartoonists. I don't know, because because of the downsizing of the industry and the changing of the industry, that changed. And so, as for the terrorist end of it, and a lot of the hostages that ISIS are taking right now are journalists, obviously, that are covering it. And I remember when, you were in the Middle East, it seemed like I remember during the Iraq War, that Saddam Hussein wanted journalists in there so he could get the picture of the factory and say it was a baby milk factory or do whatever. Now it's like, okay, they're seizing journalists to take, but Ernie Pyle took a sniper bullet, and he was one of the greatest. I've one of my favorite all time. Bill Malden, was a cartoonist in World War II, and he faced more threat than I'll face in a million of my lifetimes, and he was one of the greatest cartoonists ever. So, danger's part of it. I think there's always going to be people that care more about the truth than worry about the danger that is caused by trying to seek it. So.
Questions? I've got one apropos of Medgar Evers and then segue to Frank Melton. You are a white cartoonist in a
Very white, yeah.
black city with black office holders, and you have lampooned Mayor Frank Melton, the member of City Council Kenny Stokes, et cetera, I think, always with a big loud mouth. Do you get any feedback from the black community? Do you feel any kind of racial qualms about, holding up to ridicule black office holders in Jackson?
Reverend Bass used to call me, and he was a veteran of the 60s and used to call me the blue-eyed devil and talk about the Jackson Daily News. But he and I got to be pretty good friends over time, because I figured out there's two things that Reverend Bass loved: Tiger Woods and his grandchildren. And so we got that dialogue going on. And I don't know why, but that always kind of struck me, because after a while he mellowed. I don't know, I kind of, Frank Melton transcended, Frank was Frank. And after I started doing cartoons about Frank, I would suddenly be invited to places I'd never been invited before. And it was people loved the Frank cartoons, and it was fun, and I enjoyed that. And I've only had a couple of incidents where somebody accused me of being racist because I had drawn the cartoons, and that was Kenneth Stokes, about the cartoons. And he went out and protested me. And I went out there one time and protested myself with him because he didn't know who I was. And and I've introduced myself. I just said, "You're one of my favorite people," and he had no clue who I was, and everything else. I don't. He actually had a sign one time. It said one of his minions had a sign that said my mama was fat, which I found to be ironic on so many different levels, and which my mom, bless her heart, isn't anymore. But so I don't know. I try to, like I said, be as fair in my unfairness as they are. I'm the one who has to live with my conscience, and the way I approach it is, if I do a cartoon that my boys in 25 years look at and are embarrassed of, then I've screwed up. So.
Well, you haven't screwed up at all. You're great to have, and we love being able to wake up in the morning and see a Marshall Ramsey cartoon.
Well, I'm honored to get to be able to do that.
Before I let you go, I just want to remind you our next program will be a week from today. It'll be at 4:30 next Tuesday, February 17th. It'll be a new documentary, homegrown. It's called Blood in My Eye. It deals with the voices of some of the very prominent and angry black writers from the 60s, coupled with scenes from the civil rights movement. Our own Mickey Newton from the Meek School, and Louis Bourgeois, who's with Vox Press in Oxford, produced it. We'll have the showing. We'll have a discussion afterwards. Hope you'll come back and see us. But thanks so much to Marshall Ramsey for joining us today.